let me introduce our speaker, Linda Fisher. So I know Linda because she lives next door. So I know that she, has a good compost pile and grows things. And it never dawned on me until she said, oh yeah, I just finished my book. She was on sabbatical and she finished a book. And I thought, what book? And so it's an amazing thing when you just ask your neighbors questions and you learn all sorts of remarkable things.
You just saw me picking weeds.
Yeah, she's really very dutiful in her weed picking. So Linda's a professor of law at Seton Hall. Her professional and academic work interests, I love this, I'm reading it from her bio, but I think this is really important. Her interests link theory and practice. And so we actually did call on Linda when we had a problem on our blog, which I think she's going to talk about. Professor Fisher's, Linda's current concentration is in the areas of foreclosure and mortgage fraud, and more broadly, consumer fraud. Through her clinical work in the Center for Social Justice, she defends borrowers and pursues a variety of consumer and civil rights claims against lenders and various scammers. Linda also integrates broader advocacy efforts into her practice and engages in legislative and policy advocacy on behalf of consumer and civil rights groups. She testified before the House Financial Services Committee at a hearing on robo-signing, chain of title, and loss mitigation. Okay, that's a lot to say, but you'll explain that. Issues, and presented a Federal Trade Commission conference on mortgage fraud. Linda's going to talk to us about her research, which she did for her book called The Foreclosure Echo, how those hit hardest by the crisis have been left out of the recovery. So I'm going to stop talking, but I am really thrilled to have you here, and I'll turn it over to you.
And please time me or give me a warning, because I always think I'm not going to have enough material, so I prepare way too much.
All right, and this group will start to wave their hands at you. So,
good. So stopwatch is running. So I'm really happy to be here. Of course, authors always love talking about their books. What more do we like to do? This is the book called The Foreclosure Echo, as surely related. It's published by Cambridge University Press last summer. My co-author, Judith Fox, is my counterpart at Notre Dame. And it's just interesting to note earlier in the presidential race that our book, which includes a lot of stories from both Newark and South Bend, covers the territory of Cory Booker and Pete Buttigieg. No longer, I mean, Cory Booker's out of the race, but of course the issues haven't gone away. So Judy and I have been working for about 20 years, largely in the clinic. Clinics and law schools are courses that students can take in their final year before graduating that allow them to be apprentice lawyers and represent low-income clients. And what started walking through our doors in Newark a little over 20 years ago were all these fancy mortgage frauds where people were getting scammed out of ownership of their homes when they were having trouble paying off their mortgages. So the scammers would swoop in on their white horses and say, oh, just deed your house over to us for a year or two while you repair your credit. You pay us rent, we'll pay your mortgage, and everything will be good. And of course it never was, and they almost always lost the house, at least until we stepped in, and sometimes we were able to keep the house. So that turned me from a federal civil rights lawyer into a consumer advocate. And it did not surprise any of us who had been in the trenches to see how the foreclosure crisis and the recession developed. It had been building up for a long time. Of course, we all know that it was almost 12 years ago, September 2008, when the whole recession and the financial crisis blew up in our faces with the drama of the bank bailout in September of 2008. But it had been building up to that for a long time. We knew, incredibly, that lenders were giving mortgages for hundreds of thousands of dollars to people without jobs or making minimum wage. We knew that these mortgage brokers steered people into buying homes homes with false promises. Housing prices always go up. How many of us heard that for like 10 years? It was really a litany, right? Even apparently Wall Street financiers believed it, although I remain skeptical about that. And that they would be able to refinance their loans in a year or two, so don't worry about having the 11 or 12% interest rate, because you'll be able to get into better terms because housing prices always go up. And we also knew these same brokers were filling out false applications, listing jobs and assets that didn't exist, because our clients would come in and we'd show them the application and they'd say, whoa, I'm really surprised. I've never seen this before. Who did this? The brokers did it. And they were unregulated, almost entirely unregulated on any level. So it was quite obvious that the whole thing was going to blow up pretty much exactly as it did. Although, see, even the consumer advocates, I think, in many cases were surprised by the global extent of the crisis, by the Norwegian fishing villages that, whose finances just tumbled because they had bought into subprime securities. It was really quite amazing. So I'm not going to talk, because we really don't have time, about the whole process of securitization and how subprime loans are all bundled into thousands, a package comprising thousands of them, and sliced and diced into a bond with the slices sold off to institutional investors. I assume that a lot of you were reading in the Times or the Wall Street Journal for years about how this process worked.
Just define securitization.
Yeah, it's, well,
I wanted to do a lecture, but I just don't know what that means.
yeah, it's the process of converting something like a mortgage, which is just a loan, a loan with the house as collateral, right, into an investment vehicle that can be, again, sliced off and sold to pension funds and such. And it's, it's really complicated, and there are like dozens of players, and I've got charts that show all these arrows going all over, but that part's for another day. But you may not know that almost everything's securitized now, and it actually, mortgages started being securitized by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac way back, like in the late 30s and 40s. And at the time, it was, a good thing because it created liquidity and demand for the housing market and the expansion of homeownership rates. But for a whole slew of reasons, many of which I think have to do with deregulation, the whole thing ended up running amok, and the new ways of doing it were largely unregulated. So, I'm going to skip over that, but I won't move on without a mention of the movie The Big Short. If you haven't seen it, please do. It's just brilliant in the way it entertains and demonstrates how securitization works to lay people, and it's accurate. It's accurate.
It was a brilliant film.
It's brilliant.
Yeah.
It's brilliant, and and easy to watch.
Yeah.
Although I have to say, I got sick to my stomach and ended up vomiting in the middle of it. I mean, literally. Shaky camera. So anyway, the end result of all this was the Great Recession and over 6 million foreclosures, untold job losses, everything else. Billions of dollars lost forever because of those stagnant years. You may not know, however, that New Jersey was, for many of these years, and remains the #1 foreclosure state. We're the foreclosure capital of the country. Yeah. And I have a whole long other lecture on that, which I won't go into now for reasons of time either. But although the foreclosure rate has declined almost everywhere, including here, and it has declined a lot, we still remain #1. A lot of this, I think, has to do with very little help being given to borrowers. And in fact, even President Obama, on leaving office, remarked that he really regretted not doing more for borrowers. As I put it, the banks, we bailed out the banks, but the borrowers tanked. But a lot of this just comes from taking the pure Wall Street view too. Why should we help these people? With a whole narrative, of course, that we've all heard about, it was the fault of the borrowers, and they were just walking away from their mortgages, so they got what they deserved, while all the honest people, struggled and paid their mortgages. And in in fact, many people trace the beginnings of the Tea Party back to a Fox News commentator in 2009 saying that on TV, but it's a false narrative because the rate of people who walked away from their mortgages, like our woman down the street, is actually quite low, and there's a lot of studies out there. And the people who strategically defaulted tended to be the more middle-class people. Again, like our neighbor, the lower-income people would just struggle to keep up as long as they could and, max out their credit cards to pay the mortgage and all the rest of that. What I want to focus on, though, for the rest of the time is the legacy of the foreclosure crisis, because what I stood up to now is pretty much rehearsing what was in the press for many years, but the news cycle passed on a few years ago, and it might as well be ancient history at this point for most of us. But the crisis, the foreclosure crisis, and of course the recession leaves a very strong legacy that we're still trying in many, many ways to dig out of. So how does it affect us? Nationally, statewide, locally? Well, for my most recent example, I'm looking just to the Democratic debates the other night. And Elizabeth Warren calling out Michael Bloomberg, not only for his statements on women, which is probably the most memorable part, but also reminding the audience of a speech he had made at Georgetown. You'd heard that too. He had claimed, and this was in 2008, so maybe he's come around since then, but he said the economic downturn was instigated by the end of redlining. Redlining was the process started by the federal government after the Great Depression and during the homeownership boom that followed the war, of taking like a red pen and circling off minority neighborhoods as taboo for lending. You can't lend to those people because they won't pay the mortgages back, and there's going to be a high default rate, et cetera. But the line was based on race. The line was not based on credit. That's the really important distinction here. So Bloomberg said it all started, the downturn, when there was a lot of pressure on banks to make loans to everyone. Redlining was the term where banks took whole neighborhoods and said, people in these neighborhoods are poor. They're not going to be able to pay off their mortgages. Tell your salesman, don't go there. And then Congress got involved and said, oh, that's not fair. These people should be able to get credit. And once you started pushing in that direction, banks started making more and more loans where the credit of the person buying the house wasn't as good as you would like. So wrong, misleading.
This was Bloomberg?
This is Bloomberg. But it was 2008, so that was 12 years ago. People were denied loans because it was because of their race. You trace the history, it's absolutely clear. That was and often remains the case. It's just the legacy of what had been done many decades earlier. And many, many examples of people of color who had the credit but couldn't get loans because of where they lived, because of their neighborhoods. And in fact, what happened in the build-up to and during the crisis was what's now called reverse redlining. Those neighborhoods that have been credit deserts forever, in part because of the FHA, but also private banking practices, were starved for credit. People couldn't get loans, so they were ready to leap at any type of loan or credit that would come walking through their neighborhood in the person of these mortgage brokers who went out and solicited loans. And it's very, very striking to see this visually. If I had a projector, I could do that. So imagine an old overhead projector like we had growing up. Even some of my students had those when they were young too. And you can now, we now have a program at school where you could do that digitally, but I don't see how it's better.
But you don't have the marker right on it.
Right.
Does it make the bulb burn out right before the presentation?
That I don't know, but probably. So if you took a slide of minority neighborhoods, say in New York, and 5 boroughs, red for African American or orange for Latino or whatever, and then you overlaid that with the incidence of subprime lending it matches up really eerily and strongly, extremely strong correlation. So if you then think the people that got the worst loans with the worst terms, highest interest rates, highest costs, everything else, not calculated based on their ability to repay, and then overlay another slide of the incidence of foreclosures after these loans were given, a couple years later, again, you'd have that extremely strong correlation, and basically makes a believer out of anybody who sees it. So why is it relevant that Michael Bloomberg had said that to us today? Well, it gives you some indication of, I would say, a Wall Street billionaire's view of Wall Street and the credence that's lent to that story and that narrative. Much of the time, we just need to be very skeptical of it. But on a broader level, many African American and Latinx homeowners lost their homes and have not gained them back. It's particularly sad because in black communities, homes tend to be the main source of wealth for families. People never trusted the stock market or investing in other vehicles, but they did trust having a home, having tangible property. But when the homes were gone, they haven't been able to get them back. I'll talk a little about why. They've ended up being renters and lost whatever they were passing on from generation to generation. I just mentioned to Shirley that my clinic currently has a case representing an older guy in Montclair in the South End who's about to lose his multi-generational home in the midst of the gentrification that's occurring there. So, in many cases, Montclair, although we're kind of a fairy tale community in some ways, we experience the same things that are going on throughout the country, the same trends. Last night I looked on Zillow to see how many foreclosures are currently in Montclair. Zillow includes what they call pre-foreclosures, in addition to all the cases that are in court, the actual foreclosures. Pre-foreclosures are where people have defaulted on their mortgage. They've gone over 90 days without paying and they don't seem to be able to pay, which is why they're lumped in that category. But in any event, in all of Montclair now in 2020, there were 33 listed on Zillow, which seems like a lot. There were two $2 million homes too. It's not just limited to poor people. That always surprises me.
What the housing stock is in Montclair? 33, I have no basis to know whether that's honestly a high number or low number. How many houses there are now.
Yeah. And if I had been researching this property, I would have looked that up as well. And I can tell you the numbers were in the hundreds, 5-10 years ago. So it is down quite a bit. But
I think there's a question back here about,
Yeah, the question.
David.
You want to know how many houses there were?
Yeah, that's,
yeah,
I'm told that there are 10,000 houses in Montclair.
that sounds about right, doesn't it, as a guess?
So that's a third of a percent.
Yeah. Yes, that's the overall New Jersey rate right now is about twice that, but this is a middle and upper middle class community, so I'm not surprised at the number. But the distribution of them is not surprising either. Half of them were in the South End, because again, that people down there were targeted for the worst loans and often did take out the worst loans. And even now, all these years later, some people had kept it up as long as they could, but they're running out of steam. So the legacy includes these foreclosures. It includes lots of areas with really huge swaths of vacant homes. I don't know, have any of you been to Detroit in the last 10 years? I have. Both sides of my family are from Detroit. My grandparents all immigrated and ended up in Detroit. So I spent my childhood going to see family there, and it's just amazing to see all this green area. Drive down blocks, almost all vacant, one house, or drive down blocks, 5 houses in a row, battered and boarded up. It's almost all foreclosures. There were some sections of Newark that looked almost as bad. And are any of you from Weequahic or the South Ward in Newark, or your families are from there? I mean, Usually in a Jewish audience, you'll find some.
There's Sylvia, but she's not here. Yes.
Linda?
Yeah.
If you drive up the Garden State Parkway through Irvington, going northbound on the Garden State Parkway through Irvington and East Orange, just look to your right.
Yeah.
There's a whole number of boarded up
Yeah, you still see
homes.
those.
Yeah,
Although those blocks look better than they did 10 years ago.
right.
I did a lot of research going house to house in Upper Clinton Hill in Newark, which also in the South Ward. And on Clinton Avenue, there's this beautiful old circular synagogue. I don't know, some of you may have seen it. It's now some kind of Pentecostal church and falling into disarray, but people say it was gorgeous at one point, and they even had a swimming pool and everything there. About 10 years ago, a lot of those blocks looked a little like those Detroit blocks, you know, board up, board up, board up, board up. And I went back there about a year or two ago, just because I was finishing up the book to look, and it's better, you know, but some blocks are still looking very devastated. I know that 800 block of South 14th Street in particular. So I took the pictures for the book there, you know, just because you only have to walk a couple minutes to get a little bunch of board ups. The cover page, it was two identical looking houses next door to each other, both vacant. A couple of pictures. You know, there's still a lot, I don't know if you can see back there, but there's still a lot of this. They don't always do just the, you know, the 2x4s over the windows. You nail them up because squatters will break them off and break in and take the copper pipes and such. So they've got these sort of high-tech metal board ups that you put on there. Yeah.
I have a question. So when you say that some of these blocks don't look as bad as they did 10 years ago, but that's because people have bought up the foreclosures, and it's the people who lost their homes, they still lost their homes. I mean, so that then becomes sort of gentrified, right? That's an opportunity for other people to, yeah.
No, that's exactly right, but it works out a little different, of course, in Newark than in Montclair, or neighborhoods in Newark. That has entirely been the case. So the North Ward, you know, a lot of Latino immigrants. The flippers and developers came in there earlier than the rest of Newark, and these neighborhoods like Upper Clinton Hill, they haven't too much come back in. There are the small flippers, and flipping is the big thing now. You know, you buy one of these places at a distress sale and do a gut renovation and resell. There's a lot of that is not, that business is not entirely on the up and up either. So we've sued plenty of flippers for doing less than adequate work and not bringing places up to habitability standards. But you're entirely right that those houses that do look better, it's because some flipper bought it. And people move, and there's some research about where they go after foreclosure. Well, they have to rent or, you know, double up with families. Some of them are technically homeless. But that's probably a good point now for me to segue into the rental crisis, because a lot of this was the genesis of the rental crisis that we've been experiencing for the last number of years. So well over 6 million people lost their homes. Where do they go? They're not buying new houses. Most of them are driven into rentals, some in worse neighborhoods, but a lot of them just stay somehow in the same neighborhood. Again, more people in apartments and such. I'm not 100% sure how it always happens, but the influx of new people in the rental market started driving up rents, of course, and then our kids, baby boomers' kids, the baby boomlet, you know, there were an increasing number of those, putting even more pressure on the rental market. So we all know how rents have been going sky high in this area, and I often drive home from Newark at night along Bloomfield Avenue, you know, all the way. I've been doing this for 25 years, and it's always been illuminating to see the neighborhood change from Newark up to Montclair. But those of us who do that, we've seen all the new so-called luxury rental complexes springing up close to the Parkway. Exit 148 has their share, close to the train stations. Those are the new construction. But the luxury apartments, which which usually means just, granite countertops and stainless steel appliances. In fact, our older daughter lives in one of those in Atlanta. Those are above the reach of most people. People who have lost their home in Irvington are not going into there. So where do people go? They spread out, they do whatever they can. We desperately need that new construction, but during the recession, everything slowed. There were fewer construction workers. It's been very difficult for the industry to ramp up again afterwards. So not enough building is going on. And we've seen a lot lately about zoning, single-family zoning being a big part of the problem. That's the issue that's currently hot in the press. And I think there are issues in Montclair that need to be dealt with. I was told that not long ago, the city council voted down an accessory dwelling unit ordinance. Those so-called mother-in-law units, like you could carriage houses or building like a second store on your garage for somebody to live in. I mean, I really think we need those. I've been to Portland where they have them. They seem to work out fine there. I don't know why we can't, but this is our current crisis. It's the rental crisis now. And you can trace the chain of causation directly from the foreclosure crisis to the various aspects of the current housing crisis, where our kids can't afford houses. I mean, when I was the same age as our older daughter, who's 30, I was buying into a co-op already, because prices on the south side of Chicago were not that high back then.
So I want to say one more minute because I can see people ready to ask you questions, because of course
I just have a
So wait a
quick-
minute, do you want to just finish where?
Yeah, I'll just go a little ahead. One thing, if people have questions, I can talk a little about reforms or things I think ought to be done. And I guess as a final point, though, I would just say that there are those who also trace the beginnings of the upsurge in populism in this country back to the foreclosure crisis as well. When borrowers were having trouble and couldn't get any help, they saw the banks being bailed out, and the unfairness of that just stuck.
It's a direct line.
Yeah, so David.
Are you drawing a line of causation from the foreclosure crisis to what? Gentrification? To the what? I thought you were drawing a line of causation. I just wanted to clarify.
I am, I know, and it's a not only a legitimate but a really good question. I was drawing it first to the current rental crisis, but then the rental crisis is also related to the homeownership crisis for younger people, unaffordability, and that in itself can be traced back, albeit not quite as directly, to foreclosures to some extent.
So the people who are moving into these apartments, I forget what they're called, across from where the Cohen building was, the new apartment.
Valley and Bloom.
Valley and
Oh,
Bloom.
Valley and
The
Bloom.
people, who are they? Are they our children? Who are they?
Those rents are high over there.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I'm trying to get at your statement. Is it really true they can't afford?
I don't know, I can't remember, I've seen them, and it's, those are high.
My
Do you know?
son and daughter-in-law live in Brooklyn, and they're paying over $2,000
Yeah.
for a one-bedroom. That's why I'm trying to compare it to Brooklyn.
I bet they're around 2,000 for a one-bedroom, I would bet that, would you?
I would guess so.
Yeah,
Do you know?
I have a client that rented a two-bedroom a couple of years ago for about $3,100.
Oh, my.
Well, so this is from an absolutely unimpeachable source.
Okay.
The hardware store at Watchung Plaza.
I
Those
trust
new
those- I
units
trust
going
those
up.
people.
There's new units going up right across the street
There are.
on
Yes.
Park
With
Street.
red Tyvek on the outside.
Yes.
Yeah, right. $3,000.
Really?
For
For
rent,
what?
for what?
What?
For I don't know how
One,
many
two.
bedrooms.
For one
Don't know.
bedroom?
For $3,000.
Watch on the park.
Now, if you run the numbers on behalf of the developer, he might need that kind of rent.
He might need it.
It's a small building,
Yeah,
it's an expensive building.
I know.
so
It's everything's kind of like.
No, and we have an affordable housing ordinance and 20% set aside, I believe it's 20% set aside.
Well, it varies, doesn't it? to set
I
aside.
think
It-
the
it
law
negoti-
is
it
20%.
gets
but
negotiated.
It
they
gets
never do it.
negotiated.
Well, these buildings are small, as you point out, too. If you're building a 10-unit building, 20% is 2 units, which is good as far as it goes, but obviously doesn't go very far. And this is not to blame any single developer, because the market is the market, and our costs are sky high, and construction materials, the cost of them has skyrocketed as well. I did not mean to suggest any single line of causation there. There is causation, but it becomes more indirect and multifactored.
Classic, here I am, lecturing on economics in the presence of economics PhDs, but classic economic theory would say if you increase the quantity in the market, in other words, build, the prices ought to come down. And yet, if you would try to increase the quantity supplied in this market, everyone would be complaining about the traffic
Right.
and the congestion.
Right.
So,
Which is why things like the IZO gets, not the IZO, the granny flat ordinance gets voted down, because nobody wants to have, as soon as you mention any increased density, bang, you're done.
Right.
so
It's
is
a-
the problem unsolvable in Montclair?
Well, I do think it would help to allow more multifamily dwellings.
But they're going to be for 3,000 for a 2-bedroom. I mean, it's going to be expensive housing. Anyway, they must be filling them.
They must
Okay,
be.
let's move to the side.
Oh, I would say in terms of who the people are, though, I think some of them are my students after they graduate and get corporate law firm
That's
jobs
right.
and are a few years out. I think that's what it is.
Could you comment on Wells Fargo and what they were up to? I really don't know. I mean, I've seen them in the papers and
Yeah.
getting hit hard with something, and
Wells
I don't
has
know what their
been.
role was in all this.
Yeah, they've been a really dirty player for a long time, I could say, in terms of the subprime loans they were giving and the misrepresentations made to people. It's just of a piece with creating these false accounts, which apparently were a result of the line employees being under so much pressure to open new accounts that they started stealing people's personal information and setting up accounts without their consent. But Wells, before this came to light a couple of years ago, had been sued for years by the city of Baltimore, city of Miami, a bunch of other big cities for their reverse redlining practices, for dumping the worst subprime loans into the poor minority neighborhoods. The reason Baltimore was chosen for the first one of those big suits was because over half of those bad loans were Wells loans, and during depositions they got testimony from former employees, about all the racism that was involved there, jokes they would make about it.
Was
Pretty
that
graphic.
from the top down, did that come, or was that people on the, on the line folks who were making those conclusions? Was it systemic, was it institutionalized from the top?
It had to have been institutionalized, the type of loans that were given and the quantity they were given. And the targeting, I've spent a lot of years trying to trace it up, and I've talked off the record to a bunch of people I've met who worked in high levels of finance, some of whom say, oh yeah, they all knew they were doing this. And some of them say, well, I'm not entirely sure whether the people on the top knew or not because they were so high up. So I don't know. I know that it was not primarily driven from the bottom up, though. I do know that, so some combination. I'm not suggesting that, the top people at Wells necessarily were overtly racist. This is more about systems than anything else, but beyond that, I've never been able to get any clear answers. I don't think anybody else has either.
Not a well-run institution,
Yeah.
at bottom line.
My husband used to work as a financial advisor in a...
Louder a little.
What?
A little louder.
Oh, I'm sorry. My husband used to work as a financial advisor in one of these major firms, Smith Barney, Merrill Lynch, whichever one it is. And when he'd meet people, at a cocktail party or something, they'd say, so, who do you work for? And he'd say, well, I work for a criminal enterprise. And he was serious.
That's great.
That's the way he felt. I mean, his this place was a little bit of a target, but he said they're all that way. And he eventually left the business. But
Well, and part of it has always been, did they really believe that housing prices would always rise? Because that was the justification they used for pouring all these crappy loans into certain neighborhoods.
if you look over a very long period, 70, 80 years, there is an appreciation line there, but it's not straight, it's like this.
Right.
So depending on when you bought it, you might have been at the top or at the bottom, and when you need or want to sell it,
And where you bought it.
and of course,
Yeah.
but it does generally appreciate over decades and decades and decades, but
And lots of people will tell you, I mean, you hear that all the time, right, that real estate is like the #1 way to generate wealth in this country, period, above the stock market. Look at quite frankly, look at our president right now, right, that's him, all these guys, there's so many of them generate all their money in real estate. It's incredible.
I want to take it to Montclair. Merrill and I are both on the home court board.
Oh, you are?
And
Oh, David, you have been too.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I took the spouse seat. So we talk about affordable housing all the time. How do we get more of it in Montclair? Part of it, so now I've been thinking about that a lot harder than I ever did. I just said we need to have it. But the challenge is, what I hear from real estate people is that rent control, which is what I grew up with in New York City, makes developers crazy because they can't, their buildings don't pay off. On the other hand, if we don't manage the rents, people can't afford it. And so other than major government intervention, which I'm not sure is going to happen anytime soon, or higher density, what are we left with?
I think we have to, bite the bullet on higher density. We have to. But, it's a NIMBY thing too, right?
I think you're left with both. I think you're left with higher density. But when you talk about intervention, there is intervention in the form of rent control. Well, that kills the developers and the
That
investors.
kills the
However,
developers.
there's another intervention, that is an incomes intervention. And if you give people money so that they could rent at market, then maybe you've mainstreamed them.
So it's the subsidy
It's a
intervention. if you will.
Subsidy rather than rent control.
rather
Right,
than-
so you don't take
It's-
it,
That's Section 8. That's
it's-
Section 8.
Yes,
Section
exactly.
8.
It's always, but I think in politics, we look at the criticism of the people
I see.
who are running for president now, talking about Medicare and requiring Medicare, taking away your insurance. It's always easier to give people something, that is the income subsidy, than to take from the developer, to take something from people. It makes the medicine go down.
Right.
So it's a better approach.
Well, Vern, and then we'll come back to
So
this one.
apologies because I came in late. You guys might have already discussed this.
Loud so they can hear.
But, the problem I see in Montclair is actually taxes. It's not the cost of housing. It's the added expense of outrageous taxes on top of the housing. I say, I look at it and say, okay, should I go out and buy a condo? I can pay cash for it. The problem is, why do I want $22,000 a year extra on taxes? It's like paying a mortgage anywhere else. So I don't know if that discussion has happened yet, because I think that's really
And it's
important.
come up.
Same thing in New York City. It's not the cost of the housing. It's the taxes on top of the housing that's causing the problem.
Taxes in New York are much lower than Montclair, actually.
Well, no, but it depends, because of you're being taxed in New York City, you're being taxed in New York State, and then federal. So that's where.
Income tax,
Income
not
tax.
property
Yeah,
tax.
but that's where I'm seeing that a lot of the people in, at least my age group in Montclair, is struggling. It's the taxes that's killing us, it's not the cost of housing.
We had that conversation, Richard, my husband and I had that conversation a few years ago when we were downsizing, where we're going to stay in Montclair
They
or
moved
not.
next door to us downsizing.
Yeah, well, because we wanted to be comfortable having our anti-Trump signs out in the front yard and not having to worry about the neighbors, but yes, you pay for that right.
So I was going to, Andrew, you were saying something over there, okay.
So, yeah, so
Speak up.
I'll just make a comment on that and then ask my question. So yeah, because our son is in the process of trying to find a place, and that's definitely an issue. I mean, he looks at what things cost, but then he looks at taxes and has to calculate that into whatever he's going to pay. And so the taxes are a very big issue. I'm also wondering, in terms of density and such, I guess the tension between creating, allowing these extra people to rent out, garages, making multifamily dwellings, and how that interacts with maintaining the home value for the people who are owners, because that becomes an issue. Part of what happened was the devaluation of homes, right? The drop in housing values. And so I think the concern, and I don't know if it's legitimate or not, that if you create multifamily dwellings and increase density, you'll create another situation where current housing values go down. And so, right, so there you get the issue where you're paying more for your mortgage than your house is worth. So how does that work?
That is the concern, but it's certainly in Montclair, we're over that hump. I mean, our new small house is now worth more than our old big house was. So I think now would be the time to do that when it's less likely to have significant adverse problems. And as far as I'm aware, it has not decreased property values in places like Portland, where it's been widespread.
Yes.
Just as an example, it's really interesting to see how communities are changing. David's sister lives in Newton, Mass. Very pricey, outside of Boston area. Okay, everybody's shaking their head. So she's had a house there forever. Her daughter came. Her daughter and son-in-law bought the house, and they built a 3-story house. Looks like a very nice townhouse attached to the house. When they did it, they had to have one kitchen. So they had to share a kitchen and go through, because they were not allowed to have multiple units.
They hated each other.
They hated each other when they shared the kitchen. All of a sudden, in Newton, I mean, think about Newton, Mass. The law changed, and now you can have multiple kitchens. So now they literally have a two-family house. So, in pricey neighborhoods like Newton, 2-family houses are now becoming legitimate, and it's beautiful. And the value of that house hasn't gone down at all. And it's like your parents used to say, get a 2-family house, you'll always have an income. But that's what they're creating in places like Newton, which adds to density. Now, the townhouse that they built is never going to be a low income. But the truth is, you can rent it for anything you want. You can turn it into something that's affordable. So the whole concept of, can you make multiple dwellings in more middle-class neighborhoods, which was always the case in New York.
Can I jump in? To your point, Fern, one of the justifications for this accessory dwelling unit ordinance was that somebody in our age group who are overburdened by taxes and want to stay in the house, you put one of these accessory units on, and you're bringing in income. You can stay put. It's a way of aging in place.
Yeah. Speaking of which, my friend and Shirley's friend, Andrea Pizer, a couple years ago, was starting to explore the possibility of co-housing in Montclair. If you don't know what that is, it's groups of friends, unrelated people, generally aging, who choose to live together to be able to help each other. And there they might have the single kitchen and not hate each other over it. But I remain interested in the idea. I really have this notion that when I retire in a couple of years, I want to get Montclair to pass an ordinance allowing, more than 2 unrelated individuals to live together. But it'd be an uphill battle because you have to have parking. And if you have, say, 4 people living in the house, you have to be able to accommodate the 4 cars.
But when I had my 2 children living at home, we had 4 cars in our driveway. Because they each had a car and we had a car. What a crazy thing. We're down to 2.5 cars now. But
Well, I want to see the half car.
that's a long
There you go.
story. But the point was that when you have a full house of kids, you often have multiple cars. So why do we turn this into a bugaboo when it's about making living here affordable? That's what makes me.
I think some of it was just aversion to having whole hordes of Montclair State students living in houses next door.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't really want a bunch of loud frat boys, right?
That's true. Okay, I'll accept that.
But if these are owners, if they're co-owners, that excludes that rental population too.
Yeah.
Can you make you said something about how Obama said he wished he'd done more for the borrowers. Do you think, you're drawing a conclusion that the bailout of the banks at the expense of borrowers was, or propping up or making sure that our financial system stayed intact, that was a better choice on balance, or that there was something that they should have gone directly to borrowers and helped them first?
Oh, I think they should have done both, just realistically. I think we had to bail out the banks. I just wish more had been done for the borrowers as well. Did not need to be one to the exclusion of the other.
I was just going to say, I don't know a whole lot about the benefits versus, the benefits of giving developers a break on the affordable housing requirement. It's 20%, I believe, in New Jersey. None of them give 20%. The town allows them to do 10%, and I figure there must be some benefit that the town believes that it's getting, but it really irritates me, to tell you the truth. Can anybody speak to why that happens all the time?
Yeah, I can, because we've both been in the trenches. The ordinance, I don't think it's a state ordinance. It's the 20% is a
Oh, I
Montclair.
thought it was a state.
No, it's Montclair. It's a Montclair ordinance. Once you
There was a COA requirement at one time of 20. Is that,
it's COA's dead.
it's gone?
It's dead. COA's dead. And Montclair met its COA. Montclair as a community met its COA requirements. So even if we've provided enough.
COA is
The council.
unaffordable.
Unaffordable health, yeah. What she
From
said.
Mount Laurel.
Yeah.
There was a big housing discrimination case.
So, where was that? Oh, so in Montclair, it's 20%. So either you have to, the ordinance says either you have to provide 20% of the units affordable, or you kick into a housing trust fund. So those units up across from the hardware store, Watchung Plaza, which is a small development, that developer had to kick in, give some money to the housing trust fund, which then organizations like Home Corps can draw on. If you declare an area as an area in need of redevelopment, then that supersedes the 20% requirement. And then you can negotiate with the developers any level you want. And for each development, there's a battle.
And there's an incentive to the towns to declare, to make
Yes.
areas in need of redevelopment.
Right, because then they can get around all sorts of local issues, local requirements. And the benefit to the town is you get this development, you get this new project going in, which brings in taxes.
The pilot funds go to the towns at the expense of the counties and the schools too, perhaps?
It doesn't go to the
Doesn't
schools.
go to the schools.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So the town gets all the money.
Right,
And
right. Yeah, so it's, pilot means
payment in lieu of
payment,
taxes.
thank you. And the town gets all of that. And the schools get nothing, the county gets nothing.
So they're incentivized.
They're incentivized. So,
that's why you
so the
get 10%.
process is, to get a project developed, you have to go through the
Planning board.
well, yeah, the planning board, but there's a commission, not the housing commission, there's another commission in town that, business development, I don't know exactly what it is. So, but anyway, they get first crack at it. So they're the ones that negotiate with the developer. Then it goes to the Housing Commission. The Housing Commission is supposed to sign off on it, and a recommendation is supposed to be given to the town council. By the time the Housing Commission gets it, all the negotiations are done already. So if it comes down to the Housing Commission at 10%, and they say, no, it should be 20, it never goes back up for renegotiation. So we wind up at 10%. That's the process.
If they put money into this housing development fund in order to be able to get the 10%.
No. The 10% is all they have to do.
There's a fork in the road. You either kick in 10% of your units, or you make a contribution to the trust fund. A development across from Saunders is sufficiently small that they're gonna just kick money in. They're just not gonna.
But they're under the
Okay, so there's a
20%.
question over here.
Right, they're under the 20% because that's not an area of need of redevelopment. So one of the arguments that are going on is the small developer who wants to put up a small rental building in Watchung Plaza has to stick to the 20%, while the big guys down on Bloomfield Avenue in an area of redevelopment gets negotiated down to 10.
So just a comment, I want to also have a question, but the Times has been reporting on this abuse of this whole opportunity zone thing, and that this sounds like it's part of that. But what I would like to get...
It's different than
It's not.
opportunity zones.
Is it?
Yeah,
Okay.
area in need of redevelopment, two separate statutes.
Different.
So I would like to get us back to, so what can we do? What can we do to try and help the situation in our town of Montclair, in Essex County, in our state?
Is that in response to your question?
I'm not, but I'd like to conduct a thought experiment. Watchung Plaza is on a train station. We're talking about density. But what if somebody came in and said, well, I'd like to put up a 10, 20-story building on the train station, on that very site perhaps even?
Yeah.
I mean, what would happen?
The neighborhood would go absolutely batshit crazy.
It went bananas even with it being
So,
3 stories.
One of the things, just to talk about what can we do, okay? One of the things is to begin to find a voice for, so what would be the problem with having a tall building in Watchung Plaza, right? I mean, and so particularly when they build parking, oftentimes underground. So, the challenge, I think, for us, Sarita, is that we are silent. So we are silent. So there's one voice, which are the preservationists, which often, sound like NIMBY, but, they are preservationists. We can't put anything on the Lackawanna train station, for example, because there are pylons from the old station.
Oh, is that true?
Yeah, that's what the president, so I won't get into that. But there's no voices that say, wait a minute, that's really crazy. And so there's no, and we talk about this at HomeCore a lot, there's no advocacy for promoting the kinds of steps that would be useful in changing the conversation. And I don't see it coming anywhere, and it's hard work, and it's grassroots work, and so I don't have the answer except that I know that there's a voice missing in the conversation, which was why I'm so excited to get you here, because I think when we talk about the impact of foreclosures in our little town, multiply that. So that's my little pitch.
And there's no voice, to get back to what to Linda's talk, there's no voice in town to help the people that are undergoing foreclosure.
Not any unified
Right.
voice, right? Well, now I know when I retire what I'm going to do.
Which is?
It surely will guilt trip me if I don't.
Right. I mean, that's one of our challenges.
Oh, I'm already thinking about an open board slot for you.
So that's a challenge of what is it, what do you do? And what are we willing to do to our town to allow for the kind of density that affordability requires? I think that's a big, and I don't think there's any room for subsidized housing in terms of who's going to, Section 8 is gone.
No, it's still around.
Now I know it's around.
But it's very low income.
And we actually, I'm proud of New Jersey for this, we have, as part of the law against discrimination, a prohibition against Section 8 discrimination, source of income discrimination. So I have filed some suits, and that's important too. But it's just, there is no, obviously there's no easy answer. We've been in Montclair for 25 years. I have to say over that period of time, I've seen the town become less distinctive in its political outlook. I see some, because of the rise in prices too, some of the people who move in are, I think, more concerned with their own property values than they are with equity within Montclair. That's a problem.
I've seen that too.
It's a much bigger discussion, right, that we were talking about this last week, right, about how the schools, for example, there's a big problem, and the people that, a lot of people don't think it's a problem because it doesn't affect them, so they're happy with it.
Well, the schools are far less racially balanced.
Speak up.
I said the schools are far less racially. I mean, it used to be when our kids were in school, virtually could count the noses. Every class
Half and half.
was 50-50.
People's
And if it
Republic of
wasn't,
Montclair.
right, and if it wasn't, you moved a child of the right balance. And it was boys, girls, and race. You know, and that's how the buildings were. And I remember when I was on the board, it was shifting, and I was all of a sudden looking at what looked like private little prep schools, and I was like, what is this? What's happening? And, you know, it's insidious.
You think that we can get people to, or look at it from an environmental perspective, look from sustainability, right? Building up, not out, is much more sustainable in the long run.
Yeah.
That's density, right? Increased density, a better use of resources and electricity and energy and all that, and keeping people closer, and easier transportation and more accessibility, right? I mean, that's a much bigger discussion, right?
It doesn't have to be a 20-story building.
No,
It can even be a 5-story building.
That's still 3 more stories than what you got already.
Yeah.
We have there's a lot of difficulties with that in this town. People the preservationists want to look how people pay for when they come here, right? They want that look, they want the charm.
I'm sitting here feeling
sustainable.
very guilty that we live in 4 stories of our house, just the 2 of us.
Not for long, I'll be moving.
So you should be the trailblazer. You should.
I was going to say not for long, I'll be moving out.
You know, I had this fantasy, this is crazy, when Christopher Court was built, and Christopher
Marlboro
Court...
Inn, right?
Marlboro Inn was there on a big open property, and the Marlboro Inn was terrible, it was falling apart, it was really a mess. And so I actually went to testify as a neighbor to say, put those houses in there, put them in there, because we don't need the Marlboro Inn, and now we have all sorts of other stuff. So, and I felt very strongly that I didn't care that the houses were near each other, because that's choices people make. You live in a more dense, But then I looked at the house, and these houses are huge, and they have elevators. And my mother, at that time, I was in need of care for my mother, and I thought those would be perfect senior housing.
Well, they were so expensive.
Well, I
Oh,
know,
my God.
but imagine
So
if you were
expensive.
using that
Yeah.
for senior housing. You have multiple bedrooms, you have elevators, you take one section of one house for every 2 houses and put in caretakers.
I thought of it for co-housing.
That's what the same deal. I mean, those are the kinds of things, if we had the creativity. Right now, Christopher Court is a very quiet space. I think they may have 1 child on it because you don't see any toys or anything. But that would have been great co-housing.
They really have elevators in those?
Yeah, some of them
Yes,
do.
they do.
They're like 5,500 square feet or something. So
5,500, do you know what
With
that
with
can...
no backyard, and you can literally see inside your neighbors.
Yeah.
You can talk
Yeah,
through
it's-
the window.
it's
But you
like-
know what?
So can I.
So can I can smell when she's doing really good Indian cooking. You open your
And I
window
talked
and
to
like,
Percy
yes.
through the kitchen window.
They did the same thing at Montclair Hospital, although that they actually built townhouses instead of separate, but those are still huge and expensive and not affordable.
So-
We live in a development street.
So I just want to address an elephant, talk about an elephant, and this is coming from the home court experience, and it's about diversity in the township. I think it was 2 or 3 Christmases ago, during the Christmas break, I was sitting in the Home Corps office, and this woman, African-American woman came in. She was really stressed out, desperate for housing. She lives on, or lived probably at this point, on Pine Street. And she had just been told by her landlord that when her lease expires, the rent is going up to $1,700. I mean, for those of us who've been in town for a long time, Pine Street, when we moved in, you didn't want to walk on Pine Street. So the thought of Pine Street being upgraded to where, because they were probably going to put in granite countertops, to rent the $1,700 would sound crazy to us from 30 years ago. Bay Street train station is right there. It's a perfect commuter location. Now, I guarantee you that as those buildings got renovated, the color balance shifted. The other thing is that if you look at it, and this is the real elephant, if you look at who is on the Historical Preservation Committee and who makes up this group, Save Montclair, it is lily white. It is lily white and upper income. So those are the people who are pressing. They don't want any change, that what it is now has to be preserved in amber. They don't want any increased density. They will argue against anything that comes in. There was a proposed development up at the Bellevue station in the old Warner building. That property was going to be turned into housing, and the developer on his own was going to put into affordable units. Neighborhood went crazy, and the thing got cut back, and there's no affordable units in there because they didn't want the density. Like the best argument I heard from some guy who lived up the hill that this development was going to cause water to back up into his basement. I'm not a hydrologist, but to the best of my knowledge, water generally flows downhill, not uphill. But that's the kind of craziness that goes on, and when you see the people who testify in front of the planning board and the council and all these other boards, lily white.
That's what I mean. That's what comes out.
Right.
People who passionately care to preserve whatever they want.
Whatever they have, yeah.
But it's also true that younger people moving in don't want 2 acres. They don't want
That's true.
10,000 square feet and 2 acres. They don't want to take care of it.
Right.
So they'd rather live in denser areas.
Right.
So
Queens. So what do you see as the outcome, Linda? We have just a few minutes because I see my friends coming out of the services.
No. It's another half an hour. You keep talking.
So Monty came in now to join us.
I came for the denouement.
okay, denouement. The reforms that I proposed, or have proposed and have in the book, are mostly aimed at lower income communities. And there are many efforts out there. They're just too small scale for us to really know about them, to redevelop these communities. Some of my favorite come from the Center for Responsible Lending, Self-Help Credit Union in North Carolina. The guy who started that got one of the Genius Grants, and he really was a genius. They have a variety of programs, including one that involves some shared equity between they as developer and people who they carefully screen to come in with, it's like a rent to own, but not a fraudulent rent to own. One that's done the right way, where people make their payments in, they have a legitimate contract that after a certain amount of time of making monthly payments, they'll be deeded the house and acquire an equity share. But they are counseled every step of the way. That's free. People, there's just so much fraud out there in real estate. I was naive about this before I got into it, but real estate lawyers started telling me, you won't believe it. I mean, I'm sure Judy would say that if she were here too. So it's very labor intensive. Anything that we do that's going to work is going to be very labor intensive. And each property, there are all these liens on them from all sorts of sources, and it's also labor intensive just to get the proper legal title and to have clear title to get a mortgage and to find the homeowners who actually can make the payments. I don't think it's ever going to scale up to what we need. And I've sort of resigned myself to celebrating those efforts that do work on a smaller scale. And there are some in Newark. My friend Stephanie Greenwood, who grew up in Montclair, B'nai Keshet, so we know family from there. And she's a member of that Newark synagogue too.
Yes.
Actually, I think she's moved back closer to here. But Stephanie has worked for years, first for Mayor Booker's housing department, and now for the Victoria Foundation. She works with the city on efforts like this. So you can find all these bright spots all over the place. I guess I just wish they got more attention. And there are various sorts of mortgages that have been proposed, like shared equity mortgage, that I think are also a good idea, where the lender keeps some skin in the game. If the equity in the home appreciates, property values go up, the lender will get, say, a 5% slice of the appreciation. But the borrower also gets cut slack too, say in periods of high unemployment, their interest rate might go down, or there might be a forbearance for a while. So it's rights going to both sides. Robert Shiller, the leading economist, Robert Shiller, has come up with a model that I think is really great. There are other things being done, creative things in various European countries. British mortgage insurance, British and Irish mortgage insurance, for instance. It's real mortgage insurance for borrowers. Mortgage insurance, if you have to get it here, you don't want it because it basically insures the lender. But there, if there's a downturn and you lose your job or you have some severe medical event or something, the insurance, will make up the difference that you can't in your mortgage for a certain period of time. We just don't have any safety net here for people paying mortgages. And a variety of other proposals, that you can trot out and have been developed to help people in the lean times. We just don't have any of them.
Now, is that government supported in the UK or private companies?
I believe it's government supported. I don't know if it's the insurance comes through private lenders or not.
Okay.
I just want to make an announcement. So, Shomrei we have a social action committee. We've had a steering committee that has met, and we're identifying issues that we want to focus on. And one of the things, and Shomrei's always done quite a bit in terms of service kinds of social action, and we want to sort of do more with advocacy. And one of the areas that we've identified is really looking at our town and looking at the inequities in our town and trying to think about what we might do as a community to do something about that in a way of advocacy. So if you are interested and want to be kept informed, there is an email list. Our Social Action Network is an email list. And we'll be regularly sending out emails, letting you know what the committee is doing, letting you know about if there are programs, if there are needs to write either letters or show up at town committee meetings or freeholder meetings or what have you. That's what the email list is for. So if you want to do that, that would be a really great thing. I think we have about 25 or so people already on the email list, and of course we'd like to expand, but it's a way of keeping informed. And I think that some of these issues about Montclair are definitely going to be issues that we address and that we send emails out about things that can be done as we learn what we can do. Yeah.
So I really want to thank Linda, because I think you opened up a conversation with some information that we are all sort of worried about. And I'm not making this as a political statement, but I think this question that you just ended at, as to what kind of safety nets could there be, should there be, and exist elsewhere. What should we have? What should mortgage insurance look like? That's so there are potential things out there, and yet there are days when I feel like it's really too hard to think about. Yeah. But anyway, Linda, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.